Dear students, welcome to B.R. Ambedkar Open University video series on Block 1. Today we are going to focus on location, administration and physical topic, under which we will discuss about soils and vegetation of the country. As a part of this video class, we will try to focus on what are the different types of soils and different types of forest or the vegetation that we see in the country. What are the basic factors that are primarily responsible for the degradation of these resources, as well as what are the conservative measures that are taken by the government in order to protect, conserve as well as restore these resources. So, we start with the soil. Soils are formed by the withering of rocks, the process what we call as a pedogenesis. Soils are withered, rocks are withered either by the mechanical method, physical or biological way, and finally rocks are degraded into soil materials. So, the process of study of classification types of the soil, we call it as a pedology. The type of soils what we see, it typically basically forms from the different types of rocks depending upon the type of the parent material, the climatic conditions and the vegetations, in addition to the contributing factors coming from the human activities. All are primarily responsible for the formation of soils. So, if you look into the composition of the soil, soil typically shows mainly organic matter, what we call as a humus, which is we find on the top surface of the soil, which is fertile and that is typically required for the growth of the plants. This humus is a composed of microorganisms, decomposed plant and the animal materials. Then we have second component, inorganic components, which are actually the rock materials that is coming from the parent rocks, which includes different types of minerals, and we have water and air within the soil. So, a soil is considered to be a healthy one if it has a proper proportionate of organic, inorganic as well as water and air components. Then if you look into the vertical stratification of the soil, that is, if you make the vertical section of the soil, we find different layers within the soil. These different layers, what we call as a horizon, they are actually defined as a soil profile. So, typically we have three layers. The top one actually what we see the top surface layer, and we have the subsurface level, and we have the bedrock material. In addition to this, we also have an additional top layer what we see the humus. Then we have the elevation layer, which is nothing but the leaching one. When the nutrients are present in the soil, they actually sink or percolate towards the downwards, what we call as a leaching, that is the elevation zone, and finally we have the parent rock zone. So, if you look into this kind of cross section, a vertical section of the soil, we call this as a soil profile. So, there are different types of soils found in the country. Primarily depending upon the geology, we classify these soils as soils of the peninsular India or sedentary soils. So, these are the soils which are actually formed by the disintegration or withering process of the in situ rock materials, and these soils are not redistributed or retransported. Hence, these soils are called sedentary soils. Then we have another type, soils of the extra peninsular India or transported soils. These are the soils which are typically formed by the movement of the air, wind or the water, which is actually river. So, the movement and deposition of the soils, which is primarily by the river or the wind, are called extra peninsular India soils or the transported soils. So, based upon the genesis, that is how they are formed, what is the parent rock material and what are the climatic conditions and the vegetation that is actually typically involved. When you call as a genesis, genesis is the formation. Based upon the formation, we have primarily these kinds of forests. So, typically 8 kinds: alluvial soil, black soil, red soil, laterite soil, arid or the desert soils, saline or the alkaline soils, peaty soils, and mountain and the forest soils. So, now we will discuss in detail about these 8 types of soils. Alluvial soils. So, these are the soils which typically found in the northern India, especially these are the formed from the rivers like Ganga and the Brahmaputra. These soils are rich in clay and silt, sand and organic matter. Since they have this kind of composition, they actually support major agriculture outputs and they are mainly helping the boosting the food security of the country. So, these are typically carried by the rivers. So, what we call as a transported soils. Then we have black soils or the regular soils. The black soils are, the color is mainly because of the presence of iron and the aluminum oxide. These soils are mainly found in the Deccan Plateau of the country and are also rich in nutrients and good for the agriculture. So, they have excellent moisture retention condition and they are good fertile soils. Red soils, as the name indicates, the red color of the soil is typically because of the rich in iron oxide components. These soils are well drained and porous and are mostly found in the Deccan Plateau of the country. Though less fertile, with the irrigation support, if they have some kind of an irrigation support, then these soils are mainly helpful in growing of crops like rice, cotton, millets, pulses and oil seeds. Fourth, we have laterite soils. These are the soils actually which are formed from the intense weathering process, especially exposed to hot and wet climatic conditions, and typically they are reddish brown, and the reddish brown color is mainly because of the presence of iron and aluminum. So, though they are actually rich in iron and aluminum, but they are low in key nutrients, and these soils are found in the coastal Karnataka, Kerala and the Maharashtra states. They support crops like tea, coffee, rice with a proper management. Proper management includes some kind of application of fertilizers because they are low in nutrients. Then we have arid soils. The name indicates that these are the soils mostly found in the desert areas and the dry conditions, something found in the dry parts of Rajasthan, Gujarat and in the parts of Punjab and Maharashtra. So, these are the sandy soils which are alkaline in nature and are low in nutrients. So, though less fertile, in indicating that though they have low nutrients, they typically support drought resistant crops like millets with proper management. So, in the dry regions, since these soils are existing and for the production process of these millets and thing, they use these soils with the proper management. Proper management indicates application of fertilizers. Then we have saline or alkaline. Saline, the word indicates that they are having high salt contents. Salt doesn't mean the sodium chloride, but any kind of soils that are actually excess present in the soil. So, saline and alkaline soils, they are found mostly in the arid regions in addition to what we discussed in the previous kind of soils, that arid soils. So, these are also found in the arid regions as well as in the coastal regions of the country, especially in the Gujarat, Rajasthan, Haryana, Punjab and Uttar Pradesh. So, these soils are high in salts and the pH, both high in salt as well as pH. Because of this, they are actually not good for the growth of the plants or any crop, and even if something is growing, they hinder the growth of the plant. So they are not much useful for the any agriculture production process. Then we have peaty soils. Peaty soils are typically formed from the slow decomposition of the plant components under waterlogged areas. So when there is a mixture of vegetation with some plant material with in the waterlogged condition, that actually results in the formation of the peaty soils. These peaty soils are high in organic matter, and typically they are found in the states like Assam and the Western Ghats and in the Sundarbans of the country. They are fertile with good water retention, supporting crops like rice and other vegetables. Then we have the last one, mountain and fertile soils. They are typically found in the Western Ghats of the country as well as in the Eastern Himalayas region. So we have on the western side on the Western Ghats and in the top of the country in the Himalayan region, and they are rich in organic matter, but they are often acidic in nature and nutrients leached. So lots of nutrients we see in these soils. Despite their good drainage and the moisture retention capacity, they also support diverse vegetation and the biodiversity. So they have this kind of acidic nature as well as the nutrient rich condition. They support very good vegetation and biodiversity in the country. So broadly these are the 8 kinds of soils what we see within the country. If you look into this picture on the right side, we can see this part is all are the mountain or the forest soils. What we see the black one, these are the desert soils, and here we have the alluvial soils distributed, and this is the black soil with a different kinds of black soils classification, but overall this dark black and this represents black soils. Then we have this part as a red soil, and along the coast we can see the peaty soils, and here we can see the presence of the laterite soils in the Karnataka belt. Then if you see on the right, this is a black soil, and these are the alluvial soils B, and this is the red soil, and these are the laterite soils. These are the desert or the arid soils, and these are the soils found in the forest and the mountain region, and these are the alkaline or the saline salts, and these are the peaty soils. So overall these are the 8 kinds of soil types what we see within the country. So the soils which are present throughout the country are subjected to various kinds of human interventions. There may be, in addition to human interventions, there may be some kind of natural disturbances. Put together, we see there is actually degradation of the soil. So what is degradation? It typically making the soil not usable for any cultivation purpose, or loss of nutrients or low fertility conditions. So what are the reasons for these soil degradations? One basic reason is the erosion. So what typically we call as a soil erosion process. So the extensive deforestation that is done by the part of the human activities, there is a no vegetation present in the area, which actually triggers the increase in the velocity of the wind that actually removes the top surface of the soil. So the soil gets eroded. Over time, when the soil is eroded, in the top soil, which typically contains the humus or the organic matter, the soil becomes almost no use or a barren condition. Repeated erosion process may also lead to the desertification process, totally making the soil not useful for any type of cultivation conditions. So mostly the soil erosion happens to the wind or by the water, ultimately reducing the soil fertility as well as the land productivity. So a study shows that in India, the soil erosion, it affects around 109.2 million hectares of the land, especially in the hilly areas, because hilly areas where we have this kind of slope conditions, they are more prone to such kind of erosion during the high rainfall conditions. So it is estimated that total there is a loss of 5,334 million tons of the soil that is actually converted into non-fertile or the not useful for the agriculture process. Then we have chemical pollution. So whenever there is a excessive runoff either by the wind or especially through the water, the top sediment is actually soil is carried into the nearby water bodies, which actually increases the sedimentation within the water. Also, when the farmers are using kind of an agricultural pest or the herbicides which are sprayed over the crops, they actually sink into the soil, and through the water they are actually carried to the nearby water bodies. As a result, we see there is a chemical pollution within the water that actually has an impact on the aquatic organisms which are living in that particular water body. So, soil composition coming from the heavy machineries making the soil very compact, and also intensive farming and the overgrazing actually reduces the infiltration of water into the soil, that actually makes the impedes the growth of the root, and finally limits the roots to take the nutrients from the soil, that limits the nutrient uptake, and finally makes the soil makes the plant to die or hinder the plant growth. Then finally we have salinization, which is typically caused by the excessive application of this kind of fertilizers into the soil, especially in the arid regions where there is no proper drainage, that is to move these chemicals out of that particular area. Over time, excessive salts are built within that region that converts the soil into a saline condition, making it as a unusable for the agriculture purpose, reducing the fertility and increasing the desertification. Then what are the ultimate impact of this kind of degradation? Reduced agriculture productivity. As I mentioned, because of the removal of the top layer, we see that it becomes almost not usable, and that actually has an impact on the agricultural productivity, making the crops subjected to vulnerability, threatening the food security. So, when there is a damage to the soil, when the soil fertility is decreasing, then we see that plant growth also decreases, impacting the crop growth. Erosion in the desertification, as I mentioned, when the soil is eroded either by the water or by the wind, if it is deposited into the nearby water bodies, it actually results in the siltation, piling up of the soil within the water bodies, totally reducing the surface volume of the water body. And when the soil is removed, topsoil is removed from the soil layer, it also convert into without any nutrients, and that over time repeatedly erosion of the soil makes it as a leads into the desertification process. Water pollution and climate change. So whatever the degraded soils, actually when there is a soil is degraded because of the excessive use of this kind of fertilizers or the herbicides, and these are actually carried into the nearby water bodies, making the pollution of the water body. Soils also one of the important component of the carbon storage. So whenever there is a degradation of the soils, it releases carbon dioxide into the atmosphere instead of absorbing the carbon dioxide. Absorption of the carbon dioxide, we call it as a carbon sequestration process, but because of this kind of improper tillage mechanisms, agriculture methods, it actually releases carbon into the atmosphere, that again actually triggers the increase in the climate change process. Then we have loss of biodiversity. Soils are mainly responsible for the growth of the plants, and these plants are mainly are actually one of the source for the animals. So we find a very good ecological balance between plants and animals. In the absence of the growth of the plants, because of the degradation of the soils, it also has an impact on the animals. So overall, the soil degradation has an impact on the biodiversity, including both plants, animals, and even in some kind of soil microorganisms. So what are the conservative measures that are actually carried by the government? So we have different methods like conservative initiatives. So government come up with some kind of programs called National Mission for Sustainable Agriculture, NMSA, and the soil health card program. Soil health card is actually repeatedly testing the soil for the different types of presence of the nutrients, making progressing or looking or monitoring the what is the health of the soil, whether the soil is in the good condition or in the degraded condition. So towards this soil health card program was initiated. This typically helps us in looking into the what are the nutrients that are present in the soil. If there is any deficiency of the nutrients, then I give some advice to the farmer that these are actually lacking within the soil and there is a need to add these kind of nutrients into the soil. So what typically we call as a nutrient management to improve the soil health conditions. Then watershed management, as I mentioned, one of the reason for the erosion process of the soil, either by the wind or by the rainfall, is typically because of the increase in their velocity in the absence of the vegetation. So one mechanism is to go with some kind of afforestation programs where there is a possibility of planting the trees so that the velocity of the wind can be reduced. That actually helps in preventing the soil erosion process. Also, some of the techniques like check dams, construction of the check dams are providing some kind of vegetation barriers. Vegetation barriers are nothing but coming from the afforestation programs, will help reduce the runoff process or the top erosion of the soil, and finally also recharge the groundwater. Then we have soil erosion controls, especially as I mentioned, the erosion happens mostly in the hilly terrain areas where there is a high rainfall also. So one technique is coming with the terrace farming, where we say the step like a farming mechanism, or the contour plowing, where actually the area is also divided into different contours of the different heights from top to the ground, and having the vegetation barriers help to slow the runoff actually. So the terrace farming, there may be little bit of erosion, but it slows the erosion as compared to that of the previous methods. So this is one way we can prevent the soil erosion. Organic farming and the soil health conditions. So government also come up with some kind of a schemes like Paramparagati Krishi Vikas Yojana (PKVY), as well as NPOP, National Program on Organic Production, where actually it suggested the farmers to come up with some kind of an organic farming mechanisms that actually retains the nutrients of the soil and helps in the improving the health of the soil conditions. And also one method is the research and awareness, providing some kind of an capacity building programs or the training programs to the farmers, indicating that what are the reasons for the degradation of such kind of soils and what are the conservative measures that we can propose and we can actually accommodate, try to prevent such kind of soil degradations. So through some kind of a training programs, and that's what we call as a awareness programs, government initiating these kind of training programs, helping the farmers to protect the soil. Then we come to the second part, that is the vegetation or the forest of the country. Vegetation plays a major role in the carbon sequestration. So currently we are with the problem of the climate change. One of the simple way we can combat with the, or we can fight with the climate change is the having the vegetation that actually sequesters or absorbs the carbon. So if you look into the definition of the forest, as per the United Nations Food Agricultural Organization, forest is defined as a plant community predominantly of trees and other vegetation. So we have trees, there will be shrubs and herbs. So trees and other vegetation, usually with a closed canopy. The top of the entire forest is closed, what we call as a closed canopy. That indicates that it is a dense forest. Or all land bearing vegetation, a land where we see the vegetation association by the trees of any size, small, big or the medium height, exploited, are capable of producing wood, because the main purpose of the wood is to harvest the forest is to harvest the wood. So any land with the trees and capable of producing the wood and other products and exerting an influence of the climate. So when you grow the vegetation, when you grow the trees, they absorb the carbon dioxide, and that way we are actually trying to combat the climate change problem. providing shelter for livestock. So whenever we see there is a very good vegetation growth, we see that it also accommodated with some kind of the wildlife, either the aerial or the underground terrestrial wildlife conditions. Based upon the legal status within the country, we can divide the forest into government forest, which again classified into reserve forest. Actually, typically they all are the protected areas, and the village forest. So village forest is something more for the as a social forestry condition, where it's a kind of a one kind of a sustainable management process. Then we have private forest, and then we have forest owned by the corporations, panchayat, societies and the other agencies. So Champion and Seth in 1968 classified forest of the country into 6 major types, which also includes other major forest types. So one is the moist tropical forest, where we have other subgroups like tropical wet evergreen forest, tropical moist semi-evergreen forest, tropical moist deciduous forest, and we have littoral and the swampy forest. So throughout the country, we in the western Ghats, in the eastern Ghats, and in the northern part of the country, and these littoral and swamp mostly we found along the coast, where we have this kind of saline conditions. We have second type, dry tropical forest, mostly classified as a tropical dry deciduous forest, tropical dry evergreen forest, and tropical thorn forest. So mostly here the conditions are the low temperatures. Mountain subtropical, again there are 3 types: subtropical broadleaf hill forest, subtropical pine forest, and subtropical dry evergreen forest. Fourth, mountain temperate forest, mountain classified as a mountain wet temperate at different altitudes, Himalayan moist temperate, then Himalayan dry temperature forest types. Fifth type, we have subalpine, mostly on the high altitudes in the cold conditions. So we have subalpine is a subalpine forest at the height of 3000 meters, and we have the alpine forest, which they classified into moist alpine scrub as well as the dry alpine scrub. As it mentions scrub, here we don't see a very good tall trees, and these are actually mostly present in the cold conditions as well as in the dry conditions. So if you look into the picture, the red one actually typically which is the thorn forest. The green on the western Ghats is the evergreen forest. Here also we see the evergreen forest. The blue represents the mangroves along the coast, and these are the broad-leafed mountain or the high altitude forest. Then we have the wildlife. When the vegetation usually associated with the wildlife, in order to protect the wildlife, we have a network of 1014 protected areas encompassing around 106 national parks, 573 wildlife sanctuaries, 115 conservation reserves, and 220 community reserves covering around 5.32% of the country. Also, we have the biosphere reserves, which are the very good source for the protection of the biodiversity. And under the UNESCO, we have 18 biosphere reserves in the country, out of which the Gulf of Kutch, which is in the Gujarat, is the largest one, and the Dibru-Saikwa is the smallest biosphere reserve. So biosphere reserves are typically having 3 zones. That is the core zone, where actually the main protection of the forest area, and we have the buffer zone, that is mainly allowed for the protection as well as the controlled tourism mechanism, and we have the transition zone, which is something where we see the human settlement areas with the least disturbance that actually help us in the sustainability of those kind of biosphere reserves. So we can see there are around 18 biosphere reserves in the country, and out of these 18, 12 biosphere reserves are actually under the UNESCO Biodiversity Protected Network, what we call as a MAP.